Our next speaker comes from Tennessee to us, and she's what I call the self-made woman. You know, they say there's such thing as self-made men. Well, there's self-made women, obviously, and in my opinion, she is one. And what she did is she asked questions of the government officials. And because she asked questions, and the government official did not like her questions, they decided to target her. And folks, that's not the way it should be. Where I come from in Iran, if you ask questions of government officials, they come after you a lot harder. You complain about things, and you should have complained. Well, I tell you, that's one of the things I love about America, that you have a right to free speech, you have a right to complain, redress of grievances and so forth. But still, folks, it takes courage to stand up for the truth, stand up for what you believe in. And if you do that, folks, you're going to stand up proud and win like she did. She was charged with willful failure to file an income tax return for several years. And she was a pilot at the FEDEX delivery company, and she won. She won against the tyrants. You know, they say you can't beat City Hall, you can't beat the IRS. Well, she's living proof that you can beat the IRS if you're honest, if you're sincere, if you've done your homework, and be prepared. Please help me give a warm hand of welcome to Vernie Kuglin.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a good thing I got to know all of your faces over the last couple of days. I was mentioning to a couple of people that right after the trial, when I started doing speeches, there was really not a lot of emotional content for me, and I think it was the survival instinct was still there. However, as I get further away from it, the emotional ramifications have started to surface, and I deal with those. So if I get a little teary-eyed today, please bear with me. It's not something that's contagious, and it's probably not going to last forever, but it's something that I have to accept and deal with. Just a little background history on me. I was born and raised in Nigeria, West Africa. My parents were missionaries there from 1938 until 1962. At age 6, I was sent to a mission boarding school where I lived 9 months out of the year. And one of the things that I learned in Africa was that although they were not wealthy in our terms, the Africans lived a very free life. They did not have government agents asking them to sign forms all the time. They did not have somebody trying to control their lives, and they didn't have anybody rescuing them. They had to carve their existence out of the environment that they lived in. They had to set up their own working social structure, and it was a peaceful structure. So I believe that I probably learned my libertarian, and I'm using that with the little L libertarian, the philosophical libertarian ideas from the Africans who raised me. And so I want to thank them for the influence that they had on me. Before I get started, one thing before I get started, and I intend to do this just a little bit ago. You know, we've been talking the last couple of days about government stealing, IRS stealing, and enforcement, force, and fraud, and such like that. Unfortunately, after years and years of displaying his coins at conventions, Dan Pilla is missing some of his gold coins. And I am going to trust that wherever those coins are, that it was a mistaken thinking that they were for sale, and that they would be paid for before the end of the convention. And I'm offering that out. We need to be responsible for our own actions. And if we try to tell the rest of the world that force and fraud are not acceptable activities in a peaceful society, then we need to monitor ourselves. So I bless wherever those coins are and for their safe return. Thank you. For many years I've been coming to these conventions. I first heard about the Libertarian Party and then the Libertarian Movement in 1993, I believe it was 92. I was listening to C-SPAN, and they were covering the Libertarian National Convention. Dick Boddy and Andre Maru were vying for the nomination for the presidential candidate. And I kept hearing ideas which I had never heard in the political arena before. And I found the 800 number, called it, got a copy of the smallest political quiz, took it, scored 100, and realized that my socio-political philosophy was libertarian. I'm also a person who has studied metaphysics, the spiritual aspect of religion, and I found that as I read the libertarian philosophy, there was no conflict between my spiritual philosophy and the socio-political philosophy of the libertarian. I believe that the Creator is libertarian and created us as libertarians, in that we are allowed choice, but we are also allowed or required accountability. As I started studying things more and more, I ran into people like Irwin Schiff, who had read The Great Income Tax Hoax. I started reading The Great Income Tax Hoax. I started reading Vultures in Eagles' Clothing, Lynn Meredith, Goodbye April 15th, Boston Tea Party, some of these other documents, and it really spiked my curiosity. It's like, no way, this can't be true. If this were true, surely somebody would have figured this out a long time ago. That led me on a quest to really find out what was going on. I have a curious mind anyway. I have a very open mind, and sometimes it's gotten me into trouble. But I started reading. I found a group called Carmichael and Carmichael in Nashville, who have a cassette tape series out based on libertarian principles called Knowledge Products. One of the series that they have is the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and I began listening to those. I began to understand what the Founding Fathers intended for us as far as taxation in this country. They were very, very careful. The debates were very fiery during the constitutional amendment debates. And they did not have a problem with allowing the federal government to have the ability to tax American citizens through excise taxes or indirect taxes. An indirect tax is a tax which can be avoided either by not using the service or buying the commodity or passing it on to somebody else. What they had a problem with was the ability of the federal government to directly tax American citizens. A direct tax is a tax that you cannot avoid. They were in a dilemma because under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government had no ability to raise money during a time of crisis because they had no authority over the states to raise that kind of money. And so the whole meeting, the Constitutional Convention, was really a convention to modify the Articles of Confederation so that it would allow the federal government to have the ability in times of declared emergency and for a very limited amount of time to be able to require the states to pay a portion of the cost. These taxes are known as indirect taxes. Now, under the Constitution, and I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but direct taxes are limited by several things. First, a state of emergency has to be declared by the federal government. Secondly, the bill or the cost of that state of emergency must be estimated, and that cost must be divided up among the states based on apportionment. And that's where we, as in children, we learned about no taxation without representation. Once the share of the pie has been determined, the bill is sent to the states, and it's the state's responsibility to pick up or collect the money and then send it to Washington. In fact, they instituted a early payment discount for states who could get the money to Washington faster. One of the reasons they left this to the states was because it was such a difficult task for the federal government to try to figure out what to tax, how to tax, and such like that. The states, if they had money in the coffers, the people of the states may not even know that the tax was sent. If they didn't and you had a lot of landowners, they would do a property tax. If you didn't have a lot of landowners, then you would have a fireplace tax or a window tax or something else, and that's how the states raised the money and sent it to Washington. The other criteria for direct taxation was that the tax had to end within 2 years after the state of emergency was over with. And this was applied during the Civil War, although it didn't end until about 3 years after the Civil War was over. Unfortunately, this idea of direct taxation has caught hold, and we are still under the presumed law of that activity. There were several court cases which I was directed to. Let me go back to the indirect taxes. The indirect taxes, the requirement for that was just one thing. They had to be geographically uniform across the United States. So the gas tax per gallon or the horse tax per gallon at that time, or horse tax in New York had to be the same as that in California. Now we use gas taxes. So those are the two criteria under which the federal government is allowed to tax, and the only two. Now, in the late 1900s, there was a income tax. Congress is always trying to get money, and this idea, this prevailing idea of soak the rich, has gotten us into a lot of trouble. I think that our biblical teachings, our scriptural teachings, and have said throughout the ages, thou shalt not envy. Well, soaking the rich is nothing but envy. And this has caused a lot of trouble for us in this country. But the late 1800s, there was a income tax passed. And there was a Supreme Court hearing on that tax. It was the Pollock case. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that the tax which had been passed was not constitutional because it did not fall under the criteria of the direct apportionment or indirect uniformity. So that tax went away, but there was still a cry that the wealthy, the business owners, the corporate owners and such were not paying their fair share. So there was a clamor to have Congress pass a tax to make the topper echelon and income people pay their fair share. That ended up briefly in the supposed ratification of the 16th Amendment. And I think most of you here have read Bill Benson's book, The Law That Never Was. However, they said it was ratified and passed an income tax. Once again, there was an appeal on this tax, and it was the Bruchauer case. And Mr. Bruchauer, again, raised the issue that this new income tax was not being applied either proportionately or uniformly. Now, in the Pollock case, the dissenting justice in that case was a Justice White, and he defined in that case, paraphrasing, that the income tax, by virtue of its nature, was an excess tax. By the time the Brushover case came along, Justice White was now the Chief Justice, and he wrote the opinion on this case himself. And in that opinion, he said the 16th Amendment imposed no new tax, and it did not change the requirements of the Constitution for all direct taxes to be apportioned and all indirect taxes to be uniform. So we have Supreme Court precedents, and there have been numerous court cases, and the attorneys and the judges and the legal beagles here know this much better than I do, that there are numerous cases which have supported this decision. It has never been overturned, even though the United States attorney during the trial said, oh, well, she's quoting court cases prior to 1920. I wasn't quite sure what the relevance of that was. After I'd read these cases and done the research, I thought, well, you know, there's really something to this. I'm really beginning to believe that there's a problem with the income tax. So I knew that every April 15th that I had to fill out a 1040 form. And on the 1040 form, there are some instructions. And basically these instructions are known as compliance with the Privacy Act. And under the Privacy Act, Congress said that any government agency had to, first of all, tell you under what authority they could ask for the information, tell you what they could do to that with that information, and then tell you what the penalties would be if that information was required and you did not comply with it. Well, in the 1040 form, it says something to the effect that the authority under which we ask you for this information are sections 1001, 1011, 1012 of the Internal Revenue Code. And I have to apologize, I ran off and left my code, that pesky little book that's about this big. And I couldn't figure out how to get it in my suitcase, and then I went off without it. So some of my notes are in there. So if I quote something incorrectly, then please correct me on this. So I looked in the Internal Revenue Code, and I read the section. It says, any person liable for any tax under this title shall render such statement, make such returns, and keep such records as may be required by the administrator. Section 1011 said any person made liable for any tax under this title shall. Well, if you have read the income tax code or looked at it, there's about 9,700 sections of the Internal Revenue Code. And there are numerous subtitles. These 9,700 sections and subtitles cover approximately 85 different types of taxes, include alcohol, tobacco, firearms, estate taxes, Social Security taxes, etc. Now, out of that 9,700 sections of the Internal Revenue Code, about 1,600 sections fall under what is called income tax section, or subtitle A, which is income tax section. Out of subtitle A, in those 1,600 sections, about 600, I believe it is, sections apply to the individual income tax. So I want you to keep that in mind because I'll be coming back to that a little bit later. All right, thank you. Thank you very much. 601, 611, and 612. Thank you very much. Correct those sections. But the other thing is a person, and I had learned in my study that a person was not a flesh and blood meat necessarily. Could be a corporation, a savings, a loan, any legal entity. So I thought, well, this doesn't exactly tell me that I'm the person, and it says you have to be liable. I'm thinking, well, it says I have to be liable, but it doesn't define if I'm liable. And then it says, on any section liable for any tax under this title. Well, Title 26, having 85 taxes. This 6001 did not tell me what tax I was liable for, or even if I was one of those individual persons, etc. 6011, the same thing, any person made liable, but it didn't describe what tax for and how I had been made liable. Now, 6012 was added a little, in the 1040 form was added a little later than the other two, and it basically says, if you are liable for any tax under 6001, 6011, then you must comply, and the penalties of 6012 will be applied if you don't comply. Well, since these sections didn't really tell me clearly if I was liable, I decided to look in the index to see if there were any sections which did tell a person they were liable. And I found in the index it said liability for tax. So I looked under liability for tax, and the first entrance was section, I believe it is 5005. Or 5001, and I went to that, and it said something to the effect that these Lake Spirits is hereby made liable for the taxes under this subtitle. Well, I knew I was not a distiller, but I knew that the format in which they made it very clear as to who was liable for that tax, the alcohol tax. Then section 5005 said there is hereby imposed on every gallon of distilled spirits a tax of such and such amount. Again, it was very clear who was liable and how much the tax was. So I knew that the IRS had the ability to make this very clear and specific. I went further down, and there's about 30, maybe 30 entrants under liability for tax. And when you get down to wines, underneath wine, and these other taxes are offshore drilling, everything else that did not apply to income. Under wine, you come to, it's slipping my mind, liability for tax, the withholding agent, right, the withholding. Liability for withholding, I believe is what it says. So I went to that section. It was section 1461. Now remember, I told you that there are about 1,600 sections in subtitle A, income tax. So the 1461 did fall within that 1,600 sections. However, 1461 doesn't fall within the individual income tax sections of the Internal Revenue Code. So I went to it, and it says something to the effect, the withholding agent for non-resident aliens and foreign corporations is hereby made liable for the income tax. And I thought, well, I'm not a non-resident alien, I'm not a foreign corporation, so this obviously does not apply to me. But I couldn't find any other section within subtitle A that refers to liability at all. And prior to the trial, with the computers now around, we did a computer search, and if you do a computer search for the word liable, 1461 is the only section that will come up that shows who is made liable. So I went back to the 1040 form, and there's another piece of information in there known as the Paperwork Reduction Act information. And the Paperwork Reduction Act was passed by Congress because the Privacy Act, which was supposed to limit the number of information gathering forms that the IRS or government agencies sent out, was not exactly doing what it was supposed to be. And business owners and other people say, oh, you know, 4,400 or 4,000 pieces of document for one regulation is a little onerous, and so we need some relief. So Congress passed the Paperwork Reduction Act, and under the Paperwork Reduction Act, it says that once a law is passed by Congress, it will be published in the Federal Registry for public comment. The Federal Registry is really the American citizen's newspaper. If something is not the intent to do something to you, is not published in that document, then it does not apply to American citizens. And Congress is allowed to pass laws that apply to the insular possessions, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, Guam, the military establishments within the country, what is their federal jurisdiction. And those laws do not have to be published in the Federal Registry. Once a law is published in the Federal Registry, then there's a time of public comment for people to voice their opinion as to how they feel about what Congress is about to do to them. Once those comments are received, then the comments along with the law are sent to the agency that is going to administer this new law or this new regulation. And the agencies kind of fine-tune it so it's more palatable to those of us out here who have to comply with it. Once that has happened, both the regulation and the information gathering forms that are going to be used to administer this regulation are required to be sent to the Office of Management and Budget. Now, the Office of Management and Budget reviews both the regulation and the form to determine whether or not it complies with constitutional restrictions. Once that has been determined, then they put their stamp of approval on it, known as the OMB number. The other requirement under the Paperwork Reduction Act is that every agency must keep a public record, a cross-reference of the regulations and the forms which have been approved by the Office of Management and Budget to gather the information for that regulation. Well, I looked on the 1040 form, and there is a OMB number, and again, correct me if I'm got these backwards. It's 1545-0067. 74, thank you. I get those two numbers mixed up. 74. So I looked in the cross-reference in the Internal Revenue Code, and the first regulation that is listed is Regulation 1.1-1, and that is the individual income tax, which begins by saying, any individual with a taxable income of such and such shall such and such. I said, good. Well, next to that entry, there is one form number which is listed, and I assumed that it would be the 1545-0074. It wasn't. It was 1545-0067. Well, I had no idea what the form was, so I either wrote to the IRS or went down to where they have their forms and asked them to send me or give me the form that was 1545-0067. When I got the form, it was a form entitled, it was a 2555 form entitled Foreign Earned Income. Well, now I'm really confused because under it says non-resident aliens, foreign corporations. Well, I had read section 1461, and I'm going, wow, this form matches with 1461. There are no other forms. Now, I did see the 0067 listed. There's numerous listings of the 1040 form, but it's not cross-referenced to 1.1-1. It's 1.1-31, which is employment taxes, et cetera, and a whole listing. So this really piqued my interest, and it was almost the coup de grace. I thought, this is not an improved information gathering form, and yet it requires me to swear under penalty of perjury that the information is correct on the form. Now, the Privacy Act also is kind of known as a Miranda warning, so that anything that you write on that form and swear under penalty of perjury can and will be used against you, can be given to foreign governments, can be given to anybody. There is no privacy. So you basically waive your Fifth Amendment rights when you sign that form. Interesting thing about the 2555 form, there is no requirement to sign under penalty of perjury on that form. Now I was really confused, because not only was I questioning whether or not I was a person that was liable for the income tax, I now had a document that didn't apply to me and a document that had not been approved for the individual income tax. It was at that time that I met Eddie Kane for American Rights Litigators, and he had been in jail, and he was just getting out of jail. He said, I know I'm right, but I didn't know why I was right. And so he started doing the same kind of researching, and he began asking the two questions. And Irwin Schiff had been asking these questions also throughout the years. So I compiled 2 letters to the IRS telling them what I had done with my research, telling them about the Privacy Act, the Paperwork Reduction Act, the cross-reference, the OMB numbers, everything. And I said, you know, I'm confused. Please, would you quote to me what section of the Internal Revenue Code makes me liable for the individual income tax? And what law requires me to complete the Form 1040? I also put on there that I was willing and capable of paying any taxes for which I was liable, that I would need to see this information first, because I did not want to commit perjury by swearing to something that was not legitimate. I gave them 30 days to respond, and I said I would presume that if they had not responded to me, that they were in agreement with my assessment, and I would proceed accordingly. I did not get a response, so I sent another letter and gave them 60 days to respond. Again, I got no response whatsoever. This was at the end of '95, so in January of '96, I submitted to my employer an exempt W-4 form. And my employer at that time accepted my form, told me to attach my supporting documents to it and write on the W-4 that there were 5 attachments so that there would be no misunderstanding about everybody's understanding why I was filing exempt. About that time, American Rights Litigators had organized, and I decided to give them my power of attorney and let them write the letters from then on. And so they began writing the letters, and I liked their method because they always offered to pay any taxes for which I was liable. So there has never been a letter that has gone to the IRS which has refused to pay anything that I was liable for. I also went down to the IRS office with a friend of mine, and we asked these same questions. The agent at that time got very irate with this, impatient, and said, it's not my job to tell you the law. Go to the law library. We said, we have been to the law library. We have written letters. We've not got responses. And he said, well, still not my job. Go hire an attorney. And that's when I hired American Rights Litigators. Now, we're going to fast forward to February of 2003. There had been saber rattling all along. I had written to the IRS asking the questions. I also had American Rights Litigators send a power of attorney form to the IRS, which I signed, gave them the authority, gave them my power of attorney, that if they would sign it, they had my permission to complete my 1040 form, and that I would pay any figure that they put on that form and signed under penalty of perjury. To this date, they have never taken advantage of that. Now, one of the things I have not mentioned along, but I want to emphasize this for anybody who's not here or not in this and will be seeing this video, is that the Internal Revenue continually tells us that this is a voluntary tax system. And I had in one of the newspaper articles, an agent that was questioned said, it's called a voluntary tax system because we allow you to fill out your 1040 forms instead of us filling them out for you. Well, I'm still waiting for them to fill mine out for me under penalty of perjury. There's a document, the commissioner of the IRS in the annual reports, at least 6 times, refers to the voluntary status of the income tax. The 1040 form used to say, welcome to the most successful voluntary tax system in the world. Now, everybody's allowed to volunteer. You can volunteer. I have no problem if you want to volunteer. What I have a problem with is saying that I have to do something that I am told is voluntary. So in 2003, after these letters going back and forth, we received a letter from the Department of Transportation that my case, 96 through 2001, I was being referred to the Department of Treasury for possible criminal prosecution. The attorney that was doing my letter writing at that time responded and said that we would start getting my individual master file, that once we got my individual master file, that we would then need 30 days to review it and we would respond to their letter. Again, we got no response to our letter, so presuming that everything was as supposed to be and that they were waiting for our response and this information, it came as a shock on smile. On March 27th, when my son called me and said, "Mom, there are 15 agents here with Deborah White ready to arrest you." I went, "Whoa, cool." I went, "Okay." And of course, my heart started pounding, and I'm going, "Oh, wow, what's the next step?" I'd injured myself lifting my flight bag, and I was on temporary disability, on having physical therapy done. And it's like, okay, I need to start figuring out what I'm going to do. So I started making phone calls. I was so proud of Christopher. He said that the agents came and looking for me, and he said, "Well, you know, I think she's in Brazil." And they went, "Brazil? What is she doing there?" And he said, "She's a pilot. You know, that may be why but her car's out here." Well, maybe she used her other car. And they said, "Well, we'd like to come in and look around." And he said, "Excuse me, but do you have a search warrant?" And Miss White said, "No, we don't." And he said, "Well, then, no, you can't. And by the way, you need to get outside the door, and we'll just go outside and talk." And that's what they did. Now, I called a friend, and I ended up trying and called the attorney that was representing me at ARL. Found out that, one, he was not a criminal attorney and could not represent me in court, so I'm out of attorney. The next thing I did was call a local attorney and tell him I wanted to turn myself in. So on April 1st, I thought that was a little poetic, April Fool's Day, I did turn myself in to the federal court in Memphis. At that time, they took my passport, and I posted a $10,000 bond, and then I was released. I stayed with some friends for about 2 weeks while I tried to get my equilibrium back. My son asked me what I was going to do, and I said, "Well, I've been mouthing off for 10 years that I was willing to go to jail for this principle." I said it would be a little embarrassing now if I reneged on that commitment. I said, "We're going to trial." And he said, "Okay." So now it was fast and furious trying to find an attorney. In the meantime, I got a letter from my employer setting the date for my termination as a DC-10 captain, even though I'm flying only domestically, or can fly only domestically, I am required to have a passport to pilot my aircraft. And as such, I could not meet those qualifications. My union went to bat for me and negotiated a temporary leave of absence. And so I proceeded looking for an attorney. We finally called Mel Stamper, many of you know him, in San Juan, and he referred us to Robert Bernhoft in Milwaukee. I called Robert, and he set up the parameters, said, you know, the expenses, what kind of legal support I could get, and said that once I made my determination that I would like him to help me find somebody who could represent me, he said he would call several people he knows, and he ended up calling Larry B. Kraft, and Larry said yes, that he would come up and check with me or talk to me and find out whether or not this was a working relationship. So Larry drove up, and bless his heart, I am joined to that man at the hip for the rest of my life. But that day, he scared me. And once he had asked me, you know, well, why did you do this? What is this? What is this? And looked through my documentation and everything. And he said, well, what do you call your defense? What, you know? And I'm going, geez, all I know is this is what I did, and this is why I believe it. So before he left, he said, well, I'll think about this. And I said, do you think we have a chance to win? He goes, this is bad. So he went home. I'm going, Don, please, Don, you know, I'm going down. But Larry did call me back, and he agreed to take the case. And so he made numerous trips up, and sitting by the pool, eating guacamole and drinking beer, we set up the defense. And I spent my time. I will have to tell you, and anybody who's been through this knows, that the trial is the easy part. It's keeping yourself balanced. It's not allowing yourself to go into severe depression and to be rageful and angry at what is coming down when you know that you've taken a principled stand. I had made a commitment throughout this time. Okay, I have time. Throughout this time, I had, there were many, many coincidences, miracles, whatever belief system you came from, that happened, to the point that my evaluation in retrospect was that this trial was not about me. I just happened to be the schmuck who 10 years earlier had said, okay, universe, I'm willing. This was a trial and a verdict that was meant to be. The time is now. And that's the impact that this had. I knew that this was going to be special. Told Larry I don't want any publicity. I mean, close friends didn't even know. The only people who were involved were people who had been given strict instructions that they were to sit there, behave themselves, and not interact with the jury or anything that could jeopardize the trial. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations taught us about the invisible hand of economics. Well, in this case, there was an invisible hand. Documents that I found 3 days before we went to trial, not knowing that similar documents that the attorneys had written were not going to be allowed. Missing W-4 form. They had every other W-4 form except they said that my 1996 W-4 form with all the substantiating evidence was not available to them. During the time that I was preparing myself emotionally for the trial, in January, I was saying about coincidences and miracles. In January of 2003, I had made the decision that I was going to commit myself to 365 days of the Course in Miracle. It has a lesson every day, and you use this lesson to help you deal with issues, guilt, fear, jealousy, things like that. And so in January, I had made my commitment, little knowing that in March, by April, I was going to need this spiritual support system. I spent about 4.5 hours a day for the first 2 weeks, just trying to get myself into balance. After that, I spent about 2.5 hours every day doing my spiritual work, putting out to the universe that I hold no grievance, no grudges, there would be no anger, that I would go into my trial at peace, and knowing that the jurors, the judge, the prosecuting attorney, the IRS agent, anybody who walked in that courtroom was there to support a win, not just for myself, but for everybody else who has been a casualty of this war on the American people. The trial began on August 4th. And I think that probably the United States attorney, the government really didn't think I was going to go to trial. I think that they believed that we were bluffing them and then that we were going to negotiate. Judge P. McCullough, you've seen a lot of information about him on the internet. From the first day I walked into that courtroom and I saw Judge McCullough, I knew that I would get as fair a trial as is possible in the current federal judicial system, thank you, in the federal judicial system. Larry B. Kraft, again, does his homework. He had written out the instructions that he wanted the judge to give to the jury. He had submitted those. He had done his homework. We had given our evidence list weeks and weeks before we were prepared for trial. He had had me sit in the jury box just to get a feel of what it would be like to sit with the jury. I felt at home in that courtroom. It was really an amazing feeling. I felt that this was a play and that this was the role I was going to play and that the jurors were my audience. And that's who I had to play for. Larry grilled me and grilled me and grilled me and grilled me prior to the time so that I could, as I'm doing with this speech, and the only reason I'm able to do this is because I spent 5 months of having to sit there telling Larry this over and over and over again. And he wanted me to know that so that when he got in there, no matter what objections, no matter what happened, he could always ask me a question and know that I could pick up from where he was. I had my book with all my exhibits that he used as props. I tell you, after the preparation, having to do everything from memory, testifying at the trial was a no-brainer. It was enjoyable, actually. But that's what preparation does, and I understand from the attorneys that so many times clients don't want to sit down and do the homework and get the preparation. They think, oh, well, I'm going to go in there and these people are just going to believe me. No, that is not going to happen. Let's see, how do we have, ooh, I've got to hurry up here. A couple things in the trial. My letters that were written to the IRS by American rights litigators from 96 through 2001, which were the trial years, were not accepted. The reason for that was that my decision, or willfulness, the willfulness is on intent, and that those letters, because I had made my decision prior to January of 96 to go exempt, that those letters were not part of what created my mindset for this decision. In addition, but I had my 2 letters that I had written myself in 1985, and those were the 2 letters I found 4 days before we went to trial. The W-4 I found at the same time, and which had the supporting documents. It's really interesting. Oh, also my MFR, my individual master file. Now the government did submit my individual master file as part of their evidence. Or their, what is it called in beforehand when you give those documents in? Discovery, thank you, discovery. But then when Larry started questioning the IRS expert on my code, my MFR code, which is a 01, and those of you out there, what does 01 mean? Not required to file, and that is on my 96 or 2001 MFR, individual master file. Now, because the trial did not include 93 through 95, I had not brought my individual master file. We had not used the individual master files for discovery from those years. The government objected to that, saying again that I could not have used that information to make my decision, and therefore that information was not allowed to be presented to the jury. A couple things that happened in the court, and the gentleman who was just talking to us about the judiciary and the church and such like that. One of the things that Larry said, and those of you who read the transcript, and he was talking to the jury, and he said, you know, she's been asking these questions. And even God allows us to ask questions. Objection. Went to the bar. And this was the first time that I really got a sense that there was some urgency out of the judge. And he told the jury, you know, because of separation of church and state, we must, you know, you must disregard that statement. Later on, the juror said, but we had to, you know, we swore under God in order to this. So for those of you who think that jurors are brainless, that is not correct. Or brainwashed, that's right. They are, yes, they can, miseducated. And that is partly our responsibility, you know. We can get out there and do that. The other issue, the other time Larry said, he said, you know, ladies and gentlemen, we have 4 branches of our government. We have the judiciary, the executive, and objection. And the United States Attorney was objected. He said he's going to go to fully informed jury information. This is jury nullification information. And Larry said, no, I'm just saying that their role is to look at this. And he came back and apologized, you know, and he said, yes, the judge will give you the the law. We're only giving you the facts, and you must, you know, abide by those instructions. So those were 2 interesting things. One of the things that they tried to do was the jealousy card. In the beginning, they talked about how much money I made, that I didn't want to pay my fair share. You know, these are arguments that we've heard all the time. The jury later said that wasn't an issue. Larry did an excellent job. He caught the bull by the horns. He said, she makes a lot of money. She flies a DC-10. She's a captain. She's in charge of a multi-million-dollar airplane. Of course she makes a lot of money. That's not the issue here. The issue is, why can't they answer her questions? And that's what the reliance defense is about.
Just one question. Please tell us the liability statute they charged you with.
I don't know offhand.
It's a penalty statute.
Yeah. Let me continue on this. We can talk on that afterwards, because I don't have notes on that. Oh, let's see, where was I? Once the verdict came back I testified for about a day and a half. This was kind of interesting too, because the United States Attorney would ask me questions. I would attempt to answer, and then he would object to my answers. And you could watch the jury's face. It was just, and I would look at the jury and go, you know, like, what did I do wrong? And they would go, they'd have these face motions. And in one time in the transcript, I just really got frustrated. And I said, he kept badgering me with this question, you know, tell her to answer the question, you know, tell her to answer the question. And it was one of those questions that if you answer yes, you're doomed. If you answer no, you're doomed. You just can't answer it. And I was not about to allow him to put me in that position. And so finally, I just, in frustration, it just came out of my mouth. I said, Mr. Murphy, your question is flawed, and I cannot answer it. And as soon as I said it, I'm looking at my attorneys like, oh, brother, I've really stepped in it now. But Mr. Murphy said, I withdraw the question. I'm going, wow, that's good. After the jury was out, went out at about noon on Thursday, and I'm getting this information from talking to the jury afterwards. Oh, wow, my time's almost done. They said that the initial vote was 9 against me, 3 in favor. By 4 o'clock that evening, when they told the judge they could not come to a consensus, it was 7 against, 5 in favor. The judge said, well, you know, go home and get some rest. I think this is a little early to call a mistrial. So they went home. One of the jurors had a dream that night. She said, all I could see was your face, and the words coming out of your mouth was liable, liable, what makes me liable. She went back into the jury room, and she started looking at the evidence. She started looking at that issue about liability. She started asking her fellow jurors. And one of the jurors, a Delta flight attendant, who they thought was going to play the jealousy card against me, actually was one of the 3 who voted in my favor. And she switched her opinion from the beginning of the trial to the end of the trial. And she thought this young lady had switched sides, and then realized that she was just kind of playing the devil's advocate, asking questions. And by noon on Friday, they had 12 not guilty. Larry and I and Robert stood there holding hands, and we waited for the verdict to come back, and they're saying, don't show any emotion, don't show any emotion. I said, I won't. So we're waiting, and Judge McCalla queried the jurors, and it was not guilty on all counts. And Mr. Murphy, as you've heard over the internet, then said, Judge McCalla, I'd like you to have tell Ms. Kuglin to pay her taxes. Now, the statement that went out over the internet and the statement I remember hearing was just a little bit different, but basically carried the same intent, I think. And I have to believe that any mistranslation was done for a purpose, because that seemed to ignite and made Judge McCalla a very, let's say, special person in the minds of many people out there. My son had a dream that night, and he said, Mom, you and Larry and Bob were sitting there. There was a light shining down, bright light shining down on the 3 of you. He said, when the verdict came back, that light turned into a fireball. So that fireball went out the federal building right after Mr. Murphy and Miss White had left the premises. Surrounded the building, surrounded Memphis, surrounded Tennessee, the United States, and the world. And that is the impact that this verdict has had on the freedom movement. And I have to say that this was about my jurors. These people looked at the evidence, they looked at the judge's instructions, and they made a decision that even though some of them felt that I should have to pay my fair share, that there was no criminal intent. And that's what this trial was about. We partied afterwards. During the trial, I had not allowed anybody to make any derogatory statements about anybody who was sitting in the courtroom. The agents who were sitting back there laughing at me, you know, and such like that. Interesting enough, in the very beginning, the judge was telling people about prejudice as jurors, and he said, you know, there's a lady and a man sitting there, there's a woman and 2 gentlemen over there. Who do you think is the prosecution? Who do you think is the defendant? And the juror who was asked the question pointed at the IRS agent. And there was some poetic justice in that, I thought. Where do we go from here? The internet says the judge said, I don't work for the IRS. Knowing Judge McCalla and the dignity with which he ran his court, and he runs a dignified court, my recollection was he said, well, Mr. Murphy, I don't believe that this court has a collection responsibility for the IRS. that's how I recollect that he said it. Well, only history will ever say that. And the transcript is kind of halfway between the two of those. Going forward, I am back to flying. I have mandatory retirement January 17th of 2004, coming up in my 19th year flying at FedEx. I am back flying. I'm enjoying it. The IRS, even though I was acquitted of fraudulent W-4, and even though for 6 years the IRS never mentioned once that my W-4 was fraudulent, and other employees are allowed to maintain their exempt status, the IRS has written letters on about 3 or 4 of the pilots and dictated what they may have for their deductions. Single and 0, even though they have dependents. For me, it was single and 1. Nobody's going to have a problem with that. In addition to that, and I can't get into all the details of how this happened or why I didn't know about it, but there was 93, 94, and 95 I had paid in, but I had not filed a 1040 form. The IRS has a judgment, an $80,000 judgment against me, 3/4 of that, which is penalties and interest. If I were to file my 1040 form and signed it, that bill would probably go away because I have enough deductions and such. However, they are now levying my paycheck. I'm receiving $262.76 every payday. So they say she beat the IRS. Well, the IRS is kind of beating up on me right now. But I have to believe, as I did going into the trial, that there is something really significant going on, and that this too shall pass. This is a monetary finite amount. They may have my assets, but they'll have to steal them from me. They will not. They will not have my spirit. That is mine to govern. That is mine to choose what to do with. For those of you out there who have gone through this, you know the fear involved. You know the depression that can happen. It is a daily struggle. And like I said last night, it's having people here that will help. Now let me look really quickly to make sure that I haven't forgotten something important. Oh, I want to thank the jurors. I want to thank the people who have called me and supported me. There were people who called me every single day and said, I just want to let you know I'm thinking about you. I have crew members at FedEx now that I don't even know. It's really interesting to see the response. There are those who feel I should have gone to jail. There are those who don't understand. And when they ask me about it and I tell them, then they begin to start understanding. There are those who say, boy, you've got more kahunas than anybody else on this property. So we're doing that.